Hello, everybody. I wanted to welcome everybody to this live talk from Dr. Daniel Tutt. This talk will demonstrate another effort toward the establishment of a space for psychoanalytic thinking and practice in Pakistan. It's one of many guest lectures that have been planned for this semester through the Psychoanalysis Pakistan Circle, which continues until January. 2 weeks ago, we listened to a wonderful talk on hysteria from Dr. Ellie Raglan, and I hope that many of you will join us for upcoming guest lectures from Dr. Stin Van Hoel, Leon Brenner, Arka Chattopadhyay, Todd McGowan, Alenka Supansik, and others. What is Psychoanalysis Pakistan? For now, it's a rallying space. You can follow us and learn more about our orientation or get involved by visiting our website, www.psychoanalysispakistan.com. We help to organize cartels, which are small psychoanalytic study groups. Daniel, some of you probably know, leads a lot of psychoanalysis study groups of this kind. We also lead guest lectures, such as the one we're having today, and we have a very exciting international conference coming up in April of 2025, which is now formally announced on our website. So if you want to see more about that, you can go to www.psychoanalysispakistan.com, go to the activities tab at the top right, go down to conferences, and you'll see our call for proposals there. The conference is titled Journeying Beyond the West, Can Psychoanalysis Find New Roots in Pakistan? And it's a conference that partners the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Aga Khan University in Karachi, with the University of Exeter, particularly the psychodynamic and psychoanalytic psychotherapy program over there. It will be held April 12th to the 14th. And we have many exciting guests from all around the world joining us. So please be attentive to the Psychoanalysis Pakistan website to learn more about that. Now on to the main event, which is a presentation, a talk from my colleague of many years, Dr. Daniel Tutt. I think there's many here from Karachi. I see the numbers keep growing. It's characteristic to be a little bit late to events in Karachi, but there's a lot of people here from Pakistan. I think there's some people from outside of Pakistan. And I think we're eagerly interested in this particular subject matter, the possible thinking of Islam and psychoanalysis. There are some for whom this remains a question, and it's certainly a worthy one that's generated a lot of interest. Today, we're going to end this session promptly at 7 p.m., but we will try and open it up to some question and answers for those who don't mind being recorded at the end. When we do open it up for questions, I would just ask for you to signal by raising your hand using the raise hand button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We're also streaming live on YouTube, and I understand there's a few students from my class at Aga Khan University and a few people from Psychoanalysis Pakistan watching there. I'll be attentive to any questions that are showing up over there. So I've been in contact with Dr. Tutt ever since we first met as students of Slavoj Žižek and Alain Badiou in Saas-Fee, Switzerland, I believe in 2010 or 2011, at the European Graduate School. And since that time, our paths keep crossing. I'm pleased by this crossing. Dr. Tutt is a writer, a philosopher, and a host of the Popular Emancipations podcast on philosophy, psychoanalytic theory, and contemporary political struggles. His first book was Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family, The Crisis of Initiation, which I understand there are some people in a cartel reading right now in Pakistan. That was published with Palgrave in 2022. His latest book has really kicked off. It's titled How to Read Like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche, with Repeater Books. It's an incredibly explosive book. Dr. Tutt is also a co-editor of a collection of essays entitled Islam and Justice, New Ethical Perspectives with IIIT Press. I want to say IT Press. His writings have been featured in Jacobin Magazine, Current Affairs, Philosophy Now, and Aeon Magazine. As I'm sure you'll soon find out, some of you already know, Daniel's a very engaging and clear public speaker with a particular clarity of and depth of references from which he fashions together his wonderful and convincing arguments about contemporary philosophy, psychoanalysis, politics, religion, and the family. It's a real pleasure to welcome my friend, Dr. Daniel Tutt, to Psychoanalysis Pakistan to speak about this really important topic and the challenge that this framing perhaps poses to the liberal subject. So we hope that this will stimulate further discussions on psychoanalysis, politics, religion, and the family in the region. Thanks, Daniel. Off to you.
All right. Greetings and salam to everyone. Happy Friday evening. I hope everyone is doing very well. I'm very honored for this invitation to present here, Duane, at Psychoanalysis Pakistan. Let me share my slides. I have somewhat of an ambitious agenda today, and I think that because you see, I've been working quite a lot on this topic of how psychoanalysis intersects with the Islamic faith. And just if I could start with a kind of a personal comment. Since the war in Iraq, I have dedicated a large portion of my intellectual activity to engaging with Islamic and Muslim issues from the position of civil rights and countering what we call anti-Muslim bigotry. So it's been a big focus and emphasis of my work. Concurrent to that, I've also taken a huge interest in philosophy and psychoanalytic thought, and I have been struck by the fact of what we might call the neo-Orientalism that is at the heart of so much of Lacanian, as well as, more broadly speaking, psychoanalytic appraisals and interpretations of the Islamic religion. So I want to begin with that personal comment. And secondly, let me see if I can share my screen here. There we go. Okay, so if I go to here, perfect. Okay. All right. Duane, can you see that okay?
Yes, we can see it, and we can see it live as well.
Fabulous. All right. Okay, so I want to work through a number of points with you, beginning with what is religion for Freud, primarily, but also for Lacan. Freud, as the founder of psychoanalysis, wrote multiple texts actually on religion, most famously Moses and Monotheism, which was his text written very importantly right at the moment when the Nazis are coming into power in Germany. So right at the moment when the Jewish community is facing a profound persecution, Freud goes back to the origins of the meaning of the Jewish community in this text, Moses and Monotheism, which I'm going to talk about. But he also wrote a book which was more speculative, called The Future of an Illusion. And one of the ways we can situate Freud's understanding of religious belief is in relationship to the Enlightenment philosophers. For example, Immanuel Kant. And what you have emerge in Kant's writings on religion is the conception that religion is about an unsymbolizable sublime. An unsymbolizable sublime, which for Kant is couched within reason, right? So you have the kind of development of a reason-based understanding of religion as that which cannot be encompassed by reason. We have the notion of the a priori and so on. This is also why, for Freud, religious belief is to be taken up as credo qua absurdum, as like, because the subject faces an unknowable sublime, they relate to that unknowable sublime of God as they would relate to the absurd. So therefore, the truth of religion, and we see this in Moses and monotheism for Freud, has to do with this notion of the facing of that which cannot be provable within reason, that which upsets the subject at the level of their desire, at the level of their enjoyment, faces them with the absurd. In another valence, in Future of an Illusion, we will get the notion that religion is about a wish fulfillment, and Freud will have a kind of oscillation here, right? Where he will argue, and this is a matter of conflicting hermeneutical interpretations of what Freud actually means by religion, right? He will use the phrase that religion becomes a shield of illusion, right? So for Marx, if religion is an opiate of the masses, for Freud, also working in an Enlightenment tradition, as Marx was, a late Enlightenment tradition, religion is kind of like this shield of illusion. It creates and fortifies its own force field of illusion. Now, in Totem and Taboo by Freud, we have the myth of the murder of the primal father as the foundation of sociality. And this is an essential aspect of psychoanalytic thought for us to understand how religion fits within psychoanalysis. Because there is a claim that's implicit in Freud, which links a conception of the individual and culture in what we might call a implicit teleology. What is a teleology? A teleology in this case comes out of Freud's understanding of science and evolution and Darwinism, such that the community and the individual are developing towards a process of maturing, a process of reasonable development, adulthood, and so on, right? In the sense that the child, Freud will say that the child resembles the adult neurotic. The adult neurotic resembles a child, right? So we have here implicit in Freud an idea that a society or a community that has not handled the status of what he calls the primal father, which is what is this? It's the idea that at the origin of civilization, it's a myth. It's a myth that tells the following kind of story. At the origin of civilization, you have a patriarchal father who possesses all of the enjoyment and blocks an equal distribution of the enjoyment and the pleasure amongst the other brothers. So it's a rivalry between fathers and sons, which is resolved by the sons banding together and removing the father. That initiates the possibility of equality, of fair distribution, including also of women, of brotherhood, and so on, civility, democracy. Yeah. This is Freud's myth. Lacan will call it Freud's dream, right? There have been many scientific and anthropological disputes regarding it, but it becomes something that is a compelling myth that we return to, and it's worth our consideration. But focus on the challenge and the problem of the teleology between the individual development of a culture as necessitating this murder of the patriarchal father. That's the key point I want you to retain, and which we will return to. You then have the development of two different conceptions of God in the Abrahamic religions: Islam, Judaism, Christianity. So God is a surrogate stand-in for father, but this father is either withheld, and if the father is withheld, what this means is that the father still retains the old primal father. Like, you could think about this withheld father as the father of the Old Testament, who is a father of a kind of non-fair, non-equitable, non-modern distribution of enjoyment, right? And the second type of God, conception of God, we're thinking here very abstractly, is what Lacan would call God as subject supposed to know. And in this instance, it's best understood as a more rationalist definition of God as found in nature, coming out of the lineage of Aristotle's conception of God as the prime mover that makes a teleological set of causation possible, right? And this is also what Lacan will call the God of the philosophers as well. So keep these two conceptions of God in mind. Now, in Freud's work, Moses and monotheism, we have to understand that religion is analyzed from the position of its founding moment. And this is a very important concept in the sense that just as we had the murder of the primal father, the religion of Abraham, which begins Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is, of course, founded off of, this is Freud's claim, it's somewhat controversial, the murder of Moses by the Jews. And the idea here is that Moses also was not amongst the community of Jews, and there is instantiated in the Jewish community a trauma, and then afterwards a disavowal of that trauma, of the murder of the founder of their community. This is the same logic of the foundation of the Islamic faith from someone who is outside of that faith. And we will get to that in the example of Hagar in a moment. But what I want you to retain is the idea that in Freud and in psychoanalysis, the foundation of a religion must actually come to terms with the stranger at its own origin, right? And that the founder of religious communities tend to be others to that community, which is a curious fact, which we will elaborate on when we get to Moses in a moment. Now, the murder of Moses for the Jewish community created two types of trauma at a collective level, according to Freud. One he refers to as a positive type of trauma, which is one in which the community actually develops what he calls an intellectual tradition. You see, Freud has this conception of trauma, which is based in what he calls a latency period, such that the event of the trauma, the event of the immediacy of it, it's not immediately processed. It actually takes a period of time, this latency period. Yet when it's raised to the level of consciousness within a group, within an individual, it triggers a process of remembering, and therefore of restitution and healing, of acknowledgement, of acknowledgement of the guilt, or it can produce the opposite effect, which is a negative form of repetition, acting out, violence, and so on, where you basically are reenacting the founding trauma, right? And Freud will say that the guilt in Judaism that forms the community had the positive effect of inculcating a highly intellectual vocation amongst the Jewish people. So guilt actually, in some sense, guilt is related to rationality for Freud. The higher level of guilt a community has, there seems to be a suggestion on Freud's part that correlates to a higher propensity of reason. Okay. I want you to keep these points in mind as we proceed. Now, when it comes to psychoanalysis in Islam, we have to understand that there is a wide array of literature which makes the argument that implicit in psychoanalysis is a form of Western cultural imperialism. But as you can see, I've put a question mark here, because as a critique, right, we want to be careful. We want to be careful insofar as even with Edward Said, who wrote a wonderful and presented a wonderful lecture called Freud and the Non-European. I recommend everyone read this, about Freud's Moses and monotheism and the exclusion of non-Europeans in his conception of religion, right? I also recommend that you read Joseph Massad at Columbia University, who wrote a wonderful text called Islam in Liberalism. But their general orientation, their general argument is that psychoanalysis has not been able to escape the fact that it possesses an agenda, which is often political and cultural, for the imposition of a narrow Eurocentrism onto Muslim culture. Now, Jacques Derrida, the great French philosopher, has argued in a wonderful text called Geo-Psychoanalysis in the Rest of the World, which was a lecture that he gave at an international psychoanalytic symposium in the early 90s. He argues from a theoretical standpoint, you can understand that psychoanalysis cannot help but reshape the world in the mold of a European modality, precisely because at the core of the neurotic subject are distinctive traits, symptoms that emanate from a European social order. This is also a big question that I want you to think about. I actually don't know that I agree with that, but this is a general claim that is there. Number 3, we have a Marxist reading that I also want you to think about, which is that as psychoanalysis expands, even to a Muslim context, to a non-European context, etc., there will be one remaining constant, yeah, which is that psychoanalysis is best understood as the expression of bourgeois class. In other words, it is a rich person's practice, and therefore it has embedded within it an inegalitarian problem of access. That's one of the Marxist criticisms of psychoanalysis that we will talk about. Amina al-Shakri has written a wonderful book called The Arabic Freud, where she shows that psychoanalysis as an epistemology in Egypt in particular has rivaled and contested local practices of Islamic ethics, Islamic philosophy, and spirituality, although integration with Islamic spirituality and ethics is possible if it is done properly. She's also shown that the psychoanalytic conception of sexuality has disrupted as much as it has confirmed traditional gender theory from Islam. So it's disruptive, but it also reinforces. It does both. Again, I highly recommend al-Shakri's work in that regard. Now, Elizabeth Rudinesco has pointed to three overarching conditions for the establishment of psychoanalysis in a society that has never had a psychoanalytic institution. And I'll just read these for you. Number one, she says you must have the existence of a concentrated psychiatric approach that has already created a way of treating mental ailments, symptoms, illnesses, etc., as separate from sacred paradigms and so on. That already has to be established in order for psychoanalysis to have a general efficacy. Number two, there has to be an integration of psychoanalysis with literature and other academic pursuits. So this is very close, I think, to the mission of Psychoanalysis Pakistan, right? Which is psychoanalysis is more than just a it's more than just a therapeutic practice by far. Yeah, it also is an intellectual and humanities-based mode of theory and analysis. And then finally, Rudinesco says that you must have a state of law, and a society will not be able to have psychoanalytic practice if you have total instability. But this, I want to say, is a very relative point, because let us take the example of the Lacanian French thinker Jacques-Alain Miller. Miller argued in 2017 that if the Front National, the kind of neo-fascist right-wing populist party in France, if they were to win, he said it would constitute a threat to the very stabilization of psychoanalytic practice at an institutional level in France. I myself think that that's misleading. So you see, that third point is interesting because it also means that psychoanalysis itself relies upon the liberal state, the bourgeois class. That goes back to my Marxist point that I mentioned earlier. Now, the thinker who has written the most regarding Islam and psychoanalysis is definitely Fethi Benslama, who is a Tunisian Lacanian thinker. And he wrote a text which is entitled Psychoanalysis and the Challenge of Islam. And I'm going to give you an overview of his main propositions, of his main arguments. The first point that we need to say is that he makes the claim at the beginning of the text that through hearing and listening the speech of Muslim adolescents in the clinic, speaking in free association, Benslama says we can identify what he calls the actuality of Islam through the speech of Muslim adolescents. And he says, moreover, that Islam is, quote, the effect and the cause of subjective and trans-individual structures. So this is a very interesting claim. This is a very interesting claim for any of you who are practitioners of psychoanalysis. Now, Benslama is a secular Arab. His work is controversial, and in some sense, he positions himself not as anti-Islam, but as anti-Islamist, right? Which we'll talk about that distinction in a moment. But in his text, he wants to do, and it's a quite ambitious effort, I must confess, he wants to repeat what Freud did in his analysis of Moses and monotheism in relationship to Jewish community. In this case, in relationship to Islam and Muslims. And one of Benslama's main points is that the fact that the Muslims initiate their lineage from Ishmael, the older son of Isaac, and the fact that Hagar, who was, according to the narrative, inseminated by Abraham because Sarah was infertile, and she therefore becomes the originary mother of the Muslims. He thinks that this is extremely important because Ishmael was only later identified as the father of the 12 tribes of the Arabs. And so therefore he wants to make a claim, which again is controversial and which is based in Orientalist frameworks of Islam. So I'm not claiming that I endorse his textual analysis of Islam, but I'm just wanting us to read it, to consider it. What's important is the following subjective position of Ishmael, which is that he is the father of a nation at the moment when by Sarah and Abraham and left in the desert with Hagar, which of course is something which is reenacted by Muslims in the Hajj. So therefore, Hagar is the founding mother of Islam, which again is per se, but from the standpoint of psychoanalysis, it means a great deal. This is Benslama's a quote from him regarding how he understands Islam, to give you a feel for his political critique. He thinks that Islam is under crisis in the modern period, and he said, it doesn't have to do only with a lack of modernity, but it has to do with a modernity that has ignored its subject, one that had to do with the progressivist ideology in which had to be included the imperative of economic and technical development without taking into account the work of culture, or, if you will, a modernization without the linguistic foundations that constitute civilization. So we have a neo-Orientalism in Benslama, which says that Muslims are deprived of cultural modernization. So we have to keep that in mind before we consider his work. Moreover, he says that Islam should be seen as a plural religion, and that attempts on behalf of Islamism after 1979 Iranian Revolution, in particular, because he makes biographical points that in the 60s, nobody in the Muslim world spoke about Islam in the way that they do now. And he thinks that, here's what he thinks about Islam, in essence. He believes that Islam should modernize so that it becomes a privatized religion in the same way that Judaism and Christianity are privatized religions of individuals' conscience, not a part of the public sphere as we have in the West, right? In other words, he wants to make Islam compatible with liberalism as he sees it. And then therefore, it can champion individualism, tolerance, cosmopolitanism, and all of that, right? But here's my question to you. Is making Islam larger than the liberal version of religion as a private sphere activity as separate from politics? Are such efforts really reflective of a perversion of Islam? Or is actually, as Joseph Massad points out in his work, is actually Islam itself in its grandeur, in its singularity, not reducible even to Islamism, right? And nor is it reducible to the Western conception of privatized religion. That's something I want you all to think about, the meaning of Islam in this grand scale. Okay, let us now talk about his analysis of Islam from a psychoanalytic point of view. So, for starters, we should say that, like Freud before him, Benslama is interested in identifying this psychical moment of foundation, right? He wants to find out how, because you see, if a religious community is founded off of a trauma, that means we have a return of the repressed, which continues almost ad infinitum, yeah? And he wants to locate its origin point. And for him, the origin is actually in the trauma of language, the signifier that establishes the opening of a wall is the signifier of Al-Fatiha, of the opening of the Quran. Benslama references the story from the Prophet Muhammad's early dream at 4 years old of his heart being torn out and then stitched up. He says that what was implanted in the Prophet's heart, was language itself. Okay. And this language put forward a demand onto Muhammad of Iqra, of to recite, to read from this point. But he says that this original withdrawal opens up a space that would mark the prophet and open up the possibility of an openness. So he sees this instantiation of language as traumatic, which is a claim that he's getting from Lacan's understanding of the signifier. Okay, but he's also playing on the Christian distinction between the word and the body and flesh. And he argues that the inscription of the word, of the signifier, performs a cut on the body. And that's very important. Thus, Iqra, the first injunction of the Quran, Benslama writes that this is the original opening of the self to difference through a separation in the divine flesh of language. Thus, he argues the foreigner at the origin of Islam is language, and language is the heart of man. Okay, so this is very important. He then argues that the translation of Islam is not sufficient to merely be submission. But we have to understand the subjectivity of the founding moment of Islam as what he calls a salvation, even in the face of abandonment. And here he puts a huge onus on the story of Ishmael and Hagar, as well as the story of the prophet's status as an orphan. Because the status of the orphan means that the status of the father in the Islamic religion will have a different valence, a different composition than it does in Judaism and in Christianity. This is why he argues in this withdrawal of the instantiation of the word in the flesh of the prophet, you have also what he calls the originary withdrawal of the father. He puts a big onus, for example, on the fact that Father is not one of the 99 names of God, and that the prophet mentions multiple times that he is not to be referred to as Father, and neither is God. Okay, now, the other origin or founding moment Benslama discusses is centered on Hagar. Hagar as the bondswoman of Sarah and Abraham, in essence, what is important about Hagar is the experience of her abandonment becomes a founding moment in which we have basically happening in, and here he's making a hermeneutical claim from the standpoint of Muslim scholars and the Muslim ulama, which is again is very controversial and neo-Orientalist. So I'm not endorsing this claim, but what he's making a claim about is about a sense in which Hagar and Ishmael, in essence, make possible the repudiation of the problem of the primal father. The problem of the primal father is not dealt with, and this means that the question of the father, of the primal father, which I elucidated earlier, is kept in suspense, right? And that means that the status of God has this transcendental sublime status, which I mentioned to you before, which of course we see in the Old Testament, right? But its status here is what Benslama refers to as an impossibility having to do with the fact also of the way that truth, and he plays a lot on this distinction between signifier and body, and the status also of truth as instantiated in the woman, forms a certain regimentation about the distribution of truth vis-a-vis gender distinctions in the Quran. So he will argue, for example, that Hajar gives God a name, El, which refers to the one who sees upon God providing water. At the moment at which God provides water to save Ishmael and Hajar, Benslama will argue that, in a sense, truth can only be veiled to man, and that, in a sense, he follows, and some critics have criticized his reading here, but he does an exegesis of the Quran, and he tries to demonstrate that at each moment that a woman is introduced into the process of the prophet's receiving of revelation, you have the capacity of a, like, for example, with Ruqyah, for example, you have the capacity of a distancing of the necessity of truth as remaining impossible, as truth as remaining veiled, etc. So this is his argument. And it's an interesting argument. I mean, let me say one thing about it. There have been in Islamic studies for, I think, several years, several decades, a sort of racism about Hajar. Are you aware of what the Crusaders called Muslims during the Crusades? Saracens. What is the meaning of a Saracen? It means empty of Sarah. Another name that the Crusaders referred to the Muslims as was the Hajarines. You see, the point was, it's an offensive point to remind Muslims of their founding mother as a concubine slave. So you see, the problem that I have with this narrative is that it's trying to extract metaphysical ideas about how truth operates vis-a-vis the status of woman and so on, which is interesting. But it cannot escape this Orientalist agenda, which is also trying to sort of subjugate or criticize and offend. So in that sense, we have to have this ethical awareness about the status of Hajar. It also, by the way, relies on Catholic Orientalist scholarship, such as René de Gourn, who argues that Ishmael, Hajar, and even Abraham are all non-Arab, which is, again, a controversial claim. But that goes to this question that Freud initiates in his study of Moses, that the founder of the religious community tends to be an outsider, and that alterity becomes important for the religious community to always tether with. So you see the effects of what he's trying to argue, Benslama, of not tethering with that otherness at your origin. What is the problem? What does it produce? According to Benslama, it produces greater repression, and it creates a form of acting out. You remember the two types of trauma that I mentioned. So again, this is an example of the type of analysis that psychoanalysis brings to Islam. Interesting, but problematic. Here's another example. This is from a Turkish thinker who wrote a book called The Psychopolitics of the Oriental Father. And in this text, Somé makes an argument that is actually quite interesting. because he wants to argue that this problem of paternal authority, primal father, and all of that I mentioned, has been, he doesn't go to the original text of Quran, Hadith, the Sirah of the Prophet, or anything like that. No. What's valuable about Bülent Somme's work is that he identifies it in colonial conflict, colonial politics, such that you could think about it like this. Where the problem of the patriarchy comes from for Muslims in general comes from a perverse demand that is imposed onto Muslims, such that you must kill your father in order to be free. Right? In other words, what he talks about a lot is this kind of civilizational, passive-aggressive form of always thinking Muslim models of authority as uber patriarchal, right? I'll read this quote to you. He says, quote, "The uninterrupted omnipresence of the father figure locks the Oriental subject in a permanent semi-infantile state, puts them in the throes of a non-resolved and irresolvable Oedipus complex, regressing the Oedipal settlement from the symbolic to the imaginary, or rather not allowing it to advance from the latter to the former, and hence threatens to stunt superego formation almost permanently." So in that sense, what Somme argues is a kind of similar to Benslama, but that he argues that in Muslim authority structures, you have a crisis born from the original struggle of not being able to perform a proper treatment or overcoming or murder of the father, of the primal father. But that this is only accentuated through this colonial aggression as well. So what can we say about the implications in a practical way for today, for modern life? From Benslama's point of view, he argues that Hagar represents the refusal to recognize trauma. Hagar becomes Benslama's answer to what he calls the crisis of the gift and the blockage of jouissance that is a structural requirement in dealing with the primal father. Number two, the body of woman, according to him, is a scandal to what he calls the impossible God, because woman's knowledge arises not from speech, but from the body. And again, he provides this analysis of how the body must be veiled, and therefore truth must be veiled. And as a consequence, female or feminine jouissance must be veiled in order for the bodily thread of truth to remain concealed. So the implication, therefore, is something about how to analyze divine truth. So he's given us a way to analyze divine truth in a Muslim context that is beyond just a textual analysis. In this sense, we could invoke Nietzsche's question, which is Nietzsche posed this enigma, truth is a woman, right? If the body of the woman is a scandal to God, what does this mean? What does this mean about women's knowledge, right? This is something for us to think about in a subversive, in a revolutionary, in a radical sense. It's actually quite interesting to consider. Now, in addition to that, we have to take a step back and we have to ask, what is the meaning of this notion of what I've entitled my talk, the liberal subject? Because when we say this notion of liberal subject, there's a great deal of confusion. And a lot of that confusion is a clash of interpretations over what Freud meant by liberal, right? Is Freud's theory of the subject based on an achievement of the rational, self-regulating, mature liberal subject? And if so, does that make psychoanalysis a civilizing practice an imperial practice onto non-Western cultures. That's the cultural dimension. There's a political dimension, which is that if we accept that idea, that Freud basically pathologizes non-Western cultures, this means that Islam is forced to reform and adjust to Western standards of religion. And therefore, Islam must become a private religion, something like Benslama argues. Third, the crisis of the father, brought about by this post-colonial condition, creates relations of dependence and reliance on ego ideals to authority that block and prevent the fuller achievement of the rational subject. Okay. Nowhere is this more highlighted than in Wendy Brown's work, Regulating Aversion, in her chapter on Freud, which was actually a very important book written around the time of the Second Iraq War in the early 2000s. In this text, Wendy Brown will argue that in Freud's social writings, in his group psychology, what we have is a teleology. Remember that concept that I mentioned at the beginning, in which we have ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. What does that mean? What she argues, is that implicit in Freudianism and therefore in psychoanalysis, what makes it a cultural imperialist discourse is this evolutionary teleology in which subjectivities and therefore the institution of psychoanalysis must always be in a form of adapting its patients to this development of a fully rational and therefore European subject. Okay, I'll let you read this quote to give you a sense of it. Again, Freud's comment that the neurotic is just like a child or just like a primitive. The neurotic is also just like in the same mental space, you could say. Their unconscious is just like a primitive's unconscious, he says at one point, is an example of this. But I want to ask you, or pose this question to you. Does Freud, in fact, posit a strong dichotomy between a liberal subject and a pathological group? Is that a dualism that is at the heart of psychoanalysis? If it is, then psychoanalysis cannot think anything other than a liberal subject, right? Because if you think anything other than that, you've abandoned the core missionary project of psychoanalysis. But in Freud's group psychology and analysis of the ego, he puts forward a theory of the mass group or of the spontaneous group, which I want to elaborate because he makes a distinction between two predominant types of groups in society: artificial groups and spontaneous groups. Artificial groups include the church, the army, but you could also include like business life, the corporation, and so on. And in a certain way, what I think has been problematic is that many Western psychoanalysts have argued in a blanketing way that when they apply psychoanalysis to a non-Western context, that context, that the subjects of those lands, in this case, let's say of a Muslim society, are somehow outside of culture. So they therefore have brought in an epistemology of psychoanalysis, which is inescapably Eurocentric. I want to argue at this point that there is another way to read psychoanalysis. And this is through the work of Leon Rosicner, who is an Argentinian Freudian Marxist thinker, in his work, Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism. Okay. In his work, we have to understand that the problem of the primitive or the problem of the pre-Oedipal or the problem of the pathological subject is not to be understood as the full achievement of the mainstream bourgeois group. No. In his reading, the bourgeois group, the church, the army, the main institutions of capitalist society, reflect a form of they deprive their subjects of the type of rational independence that Freud is after. In that sense, with Rosichnier's model of thinking, I believe that we can overcome these false dualisms and dichotomies, whereby we have this Eurocentric teleology of psychoanalysis, which is very nonsensical, because in that framework, we lose, it's basically what we might call an anti-political framework of thinking psychoanalysis, because ultimately it means that the final, the greatest achievement that institutions can build to would be what already exists. But here's the key point that Rosichnir points out. This is not the agenda that Freud had when he wrote group psychology. Well, who was Freud writing group psychology against? Freud was writing it against the liberal bourgeois intelligentsia, specifically Gustave Le Bon. Gustave Le Bon is presented in the text as basically everything that interpreters of Freud think Freud represents, which is like full stabilization of bourgeois order is the agenda of the day, and that ultimately we must pacify the spontaneous groups. Because again, there's these group formations that Freud elucidates. The spontaneous group is the most interesting one because it is the one that possesses the most rationality. And what is the example that Freud uses of these spontaneous groups? Well, it's actually militant revolutionary uprisings around the time of the communist revolt against fascism in Germany, which Freud is praising, right? So we have embedded in Freud, therefore, a criticism of the bourgeois subject. One of the problems that we've had is that people have conflated liberal and bourgeois. In other words, they have forgotten this distinction. Therefore, I want to make the following claim. You can see it at the top title here. In a condensed form, liberalism is an internal class and institutional distinction within any social order. Therefore, in Pakistan, you have a liberalism as formed on hegemonic bourgeois class relations, just as we do in the United States. Bourgeois is not a teleology, therefore, of an intrinsically Eurocentric export model. That would be overly culturalizing Freud. We don't have to do that. This is why the Marxist reading of Freud, I think, is superior. Again, according to Freud, artificial groups, the church, the army, the Islamic society, we could say, have an ambivalent social bond. The unsatisfied desire of the group is organized as aggression, and the feelings of hostility of the group members are repressed. That's in the mainstream liberal groups, is what Freud is saying. This repression constitutes what Freud calls conscience, as well as superego. Therefore, I would say that an Islamic or a religious group can be a bourgeois group, or it can also be a mass or a spontaneous group, depending on the context. There are limitations, therefore, with blanketing Islamic societies as homogeneous and not as heterogeneous, because Islamic societies in capitalism are shaped by class, just as non-Islamic societies are shaped by class. Artificial groups, religious institutions, the army, or the corporation keep their subjects in a condition of what Freud calls infantile dependence. The artificial group bond is based on a shared sense of persecution of each member. They are therefore rivalrous institutions. This is also why you see Freud has an implicit criticism of bourgeois groups. This is why I say against the liberal subject. Okay, you could also say against the bourgeois subject. Okay, if we don't make these distinctions, then Freud does become this Eurocentric figure that we cannot learn from in a true way. Now, Freud thinks in group psychology, breaks from the artificial groups, and he thinks them as being capable of confronting the repression that goes ignored in the artificial group. So therefore, the revolutionary group, which he hints at, is superior to the mainstream bourgeois group because it is conscience. It sets itself the mission of locating the repression at the core of the group. Some concluding thoughts for you. In my view, psychoanalysis is an emancipatory practice that's meant to foster subjective independence. But this does not imply that psychoanalysis must, by extension, mold its subjects in the form of its Western European origins. Number two, deeper textual analysis must be made into the hermeneutics of the Quran as well as the Hadith and how these textual traditions shape Muslim subjectivity, because Benslama clearly has an Orientalist agenda in his reading of Islam, and that's problematic. However, there are ways to have a non-Orientalist reading using psychoanalysis. The problem is that it hasn't been done. So I want to invite you to consider doing that if you're interested. Three, not only in the textual field, but also in the study of ruh, of soul, of the Islamic conception of the self, and psychoanalytic, how they compare and contrast to psychoanalytic conceptions of the subject. And then finally, Freud's theory of otherness at the foundation of the community and his theory of the primal father, while they may be problematic in their own ways, still give us very vital theoretical insights about the general dispensation of truth, about sexual difference, about the distinction between signifier and body, about trauma and the maintenance of trauma. Yeah? I want to leave you now with a visual that might interest you from a 2018 publication entitled Toward a Framework for Islamic Psychology and Psychotherapy. And this is a presentation of a model of the soul in Islam. And it's in Arabic, but I can do like a quick sort of translation, and then I'll open up the floor for questions. In the center, we have body, heart, and mind, in essence, in the center here. And we have like the conception of a higher and a lower self, right? And this, by the way, was this is a wonderful text. It's a wonderful essay. I've given you the reference to the essay on the far right. This is an example of how you might begin to take the Lacanian or the Freudian conception of the subject and actually think it in a genuine way, not in an Orientalist way, with the Islamic tradition. What is, for example, many questions are emerged here. The fact that the subject begins in fitra, not original sin, is something that Benslama speaks nothing about. But it is a massive difference from the Christian conception of the subject, right? How can we theorize this vis-a-vis Lacan's theory of the imaginary, right? This notion of the self as conceived of struggle, of jihad, of a higher and lower form is another domain in which we could theorize vis-a-vis psychoanalysis. Moreover, the whole thing on the left about the idea of character, right, and purification, the necessity of purifying the self, right? So all of these things hopefully will give you a more positive way to begin to think about making some of these translations and some of these comparisons more actualized in your practice. And Dwayne, I think with that, I'll close, and we will go to questions.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Uh, really incredible paper, as I'm sure, or presentation, I should say, as I'm sure everybody agrees. Really breathtaking. I can imagine this being the beginnings of your next book, but maybe I'm wrong. Uh, I'm going to open it up to questions. We have about 20, we have 21 minutes to be very precise. So I'm looking for people to raise their hand. If I may, maybe I'll begin with a question while others are thinking. Um, Again, I feel like I'm quite struck by the genius of this presentation. I just want to offer an obscure question, uh, which will probably demonstrate my misunderstandings. You offered something that sounds to me like a concept. I like the expression, this phrase, so much that I think I feel like I want to conceptualize it. You call it the withdrawal of the father. Uh, And I was thinking that in psychoanalysis, even let's say in psychosis, the father really never truly withdraws. And when the father does withdraw, actually becomes, in a sense, more proximate. Uh, we see it in the the father in Judge Schreber's Psychosis. So my question is, uh, it has to do with the supposition of the father, that is the name of the father. Uh, my question is there a supposition that the father must always, in some sense, be universal in scope and prohibitive in function and so on? I don't know how else to put it. There's this sense in Lacan that one can do without the father. Uh, one can make do with the withdrawal of the father, provided that one makes use of the function of the father. And I wonder about the role of imams, of sheikhs, and so on within Islam. So it's a question that I'm trying to formulate. There's also, when you describe Hagar, peace be upon her, as the mother of Islam, I would say this actually isn't something that many Muslims, as far as I know, it's my own, I've never heard that expression. I've not heard it. And I guess it makes me question what we mean by fathers, what we mean by mothers. I'll get to my point. Is it possible that a particular reading of the father and the mother can get in the way of an Islamic psychoanalysis? Again, Lacan said that one can do without the father, provided that it's put to use, and he increasingly places the father in other registers, even in symptoms and gadgets and so on. And I think it's something that we learn about, especially in the contemporary moment when science and capitalism and Western civilization have given us many names of the father. Maybe the cell phone is a name of the father. And so in this sense, we could claim we can also carry our imam in our pocket. It might not be a very good imam, but some of us, I have Muslim Pro in my pocket. So it's a question not of the paternal conditions for psychoanalysis, but of the limitations that stand in the way of a psychoanalysis that could have been or could be invented from this place. I understand it's probably a gross misreading of some of the things you're saying, so I just leave it with you to play with however you like. Thank you. You're muted.
Oh, there we go. Oh, sorry. Yes, Dwayne, beautiful questions, wonderful points. I mean, yes, think about it this way for a second. If we were to essentialize the subjectivity of Americans or Europeans from a textual analysis of Christ saying on the cross, my Father, why have you forsaken me? And then we were to derive a conclusion regarding how modern subjects today relate to authority as such. You see, that would be very crude and very vulgar and very false. Benslama, because he has an understanding of fundamentalism and Islamism in the way that he does that. In other words, the problem with Benslama And the problem, therefore, with a lot of psychoanalysts is this essentialization of Islam. That's the main problem. At the same time, we want to be able to abstract, because his other claim, which I think is also true, is that the speech of Muslim patients, of Muslim analysts, we can see a grammar of an analogy to the way that the textual tradition has shaped their subjectivity. This requires a constant hermeneutical analysis, and it's why I want to encourage everyone that practices psychoanalysis to think in this way, to think more in this way, but to think it without the baggage of these neo-Orientalist frameworks, such as the position of Hagar, which I told you about, has this history of a passive-aggressive colonialist crusader conception, where they try to make Hagar into a prominent figure precisely because they see her position as disavowed, which is not exactly true, because I spoke to many Muslim scholars and they say, if that's true, then why is she so honored in the pilgrimage, which she is. So there's a lot of political Orientalist things we need to get through. To the point regarding father, I mean, look, I think it's easier to think about paternal authority, patriarchy, and so on from a more recent historical valence than situating it in the subjectivity of the prophet, peace be upon him, But that's also, again, what Benslama does. Because, again, he's reading Islam through this, through the lens of what he sees as his enemy, which is Islamists. And if they over-literalize, he over-literalizes. So it creates this kind of misrecognition in a certain way. Now, I think it is true, and it is something for us to meditate upon, this framework of submission to God in the face of abandonment by father. In a certain way, it's a very radical conception, which I think that allowed for an emancipatory, but also served a practical function for the early Muslims, insofar as the status of the orphan was a common status of subjectivity, especially in times of great war and great violence. For example, Juan Cole's new book on the origins of the Muslim community and why Salam is so central to Muslims had everything to do with the fact that there were basically like three empires: the Byzantine, Western Catholic, and Persian, that were at war with each other. Muhammad's community emerges as a moment in which the possibility of the ending of these great cycles of violence would be possible. I'm also thinking here of Shahab Ahmed's incredible work, What is Islam?, which came out recently, where he shows that as Islam expands to the east, in what he calls the Balkans to Bengal complex, you have emerged a kind of non-violent Sufi philosophical, what he calls Sufi philosophical amalgam, in which Islam spreads, precisely through the Shahada, not necessarily through a legalistic conception, right? So there are many Islams. There is this kind of, he says, Islam is defined in this multiplicity, in its plurality. Benslama, through this neo-Orientalist vision, wants to say there are many Islams, but he wants to do something worse than that. He wants to actually deprive Islam of its own singularity as separate from Western tradition, which I think that it is in its own way. He wants to privatize Islam in a certain way. And that, I think, is the heart of the issue here, and where psychoanalysis needs to be extremely ethically cautious, okay? Because I don't want to say, Duane, that, we can create a sociological account of how paternity is dealt with by Muslims across the Muslim world based on this textual claim of causality. I think that's quite naive. For example, I would argue that the experience of colonialism in Indonesia versus Pakistan versus Egypt will produce distinctive forms of dealing with the father problem, etc., including cultural traditions that precede Islam in some cases. I would argue that those are probably more essential in thinking patriarchal relations than is Islam. Moreover, we also know the great egalitarian thrust of certain gender rights under the establishment of Muslim polities, which are disavowed, including things such as the political leadership of women, dowry and divorce rights for women, which some pre-Islamic societies don't possess, for example. So there's quite a lot to parse through, and I don't want to be overly textualist, while at the same time, what I'm wanting to say to everyone here, in which I say, because I'm not a Islamicist expert, okay, but what I would love to see, Duane, is someone with an expertise and steeped psychoanalytic theory, as well as textual Islamic mastery, perform a better appraisal of how the textual intersects with the subjective. But yeah, I mean, then finally, Duane, I'll just say, like, in final thought here is, I find it problematic to take the structures, say perversion, psychosis, and generalize them back onto the story of the prophet, peace be upon him. I find that problematic. And then extrapolate from them, well, then we can identify a generalized perversion in the Islamist subject, which is, by the way, what Benslama says. Because he has this argument of the repudiation of origins. That's where Hagar comes in. Hagar allows the transcendental sublime God precisely because in his argument, she stands for not facing that original trauma, like that submission. So it's like an unprocessed trauma, I guess you could say, in some sense. That's his argument, to summarize it. Again, it's a problematic argument, but I'm sharing it with you also to give you a feeling of how psychoanalysts use Freud and abuse. And also, as I've tried to demonstrate, as finally is like, yeah, like maybe Rosa Schneer's model is the only model of thinking Freud in a context where we de-imperialize psychoanalysis, if you know what I mean. Right? That was one of the things I was trying to conclude with. So I'll stop there. Hopefully some of that works for you, Duane.
Again, very masterful. We do have some questions. Um, uh, really got a lot from that response. I'm thinking about also, though, uh, one place to learn how the subjective and let's say the textual traditions come together is in learning from patients who have demanded analysis, who are themselves Muslim, who live in let's say Muslim civilization. And what we've learned, at least here in Pakistan, is that people do come with a demand for analysis. And so instead of beginning from the textual tradition and moving to the subjective, to begin from the speech and then to go in the maybe I don't know if it's the opposite direction. We have a few questions. I think one of them you've already responded to in a really nice way, and that was a question about whether the withdrawal of the father is the same as foreclosure. That was from Vulcan. I think you've just responded to that. We have a question that's quite broad from Zia. Do you think it's possible to develop a form of psychoanalysis that's truly compatible with Islamic values? And what do you think that would look like? I think you started to open up toward the end of your talk with some coordinates for that, but maybe you want to speak just a little bit more casually about it.
Yeah, definitely. I certainly do. There are actually, in fact, many examples. And I want to point your attention to a work of 2017 by Omina Al-Shakri called The Arabic Freud. um, which is a very interesting work looking at Yusuf Murad, who's the first Egyptian to translate and interpret Freud into Arabic. And one of the things that we know is that, unfortunately, and you see this in Joseph Massad's work, Islam and Liberalism, that the majority of, let's say, Muslim by origin psychoanalysts that train in France, Lacanians, have tended to have this ultra secularist, neo-Orientalist sort of agenda. Mustafa Safun, who is one example, wrote a book which the title of the book alone will show you his agenda. Why the Arabs Are Not Free, which has everything to do actually with a claim about language and the distinction between the hierarchy and elitism of modern standard Arabic and so on. But Yusuf Murad is more interesting because what Murad was able to do was go into not the text. See, part of the problem, Duane, is where you get into trouble, I think. So when you provide an overly textualist analysis, that's the Orientalist approach in some sense. What he does rather is he goes into the study of ruh, the study of the spirituality side of Islam, Sufism as well. Here, I think you have a more productive terrain in which we can make, let's say, a rapprochement between Islam and psychoanalysis. I probably should have talked more about that, but part of the reason I wanted to give you the Benslama framework is because it's the most widely read, and it is the most common example that you get. Okay. But in some sense, al-Shakri argues that she says, quote, in contrast to the alleged incommensurability between psychoanalysis and Islam, post-war psychoanalysis in Egypt was able to breathe new life into earlier pre-modern classical literature centered on desire, on the appetites, and the ethical cultivation of the child. She argues that Sufism was the primary way that this rapprochement worked. And she argues that the relation of authority between analyst and analysand is very close to what in Sufism is the sheikh-disciple relationship, right? So you have in her argument, in Yusuf Murad's work, what you might call a great field of analogical insight, yeah, that can be quite productive. Another thing that Yusuf Murad does is that he goes back to Al-Ghazali's conceptions of the self and compares them to Freud, which, remember the last diagram I showed you? That's another fertile domain of intellectual activity that I would encourage everyone to pursue. So there's a lot here, you know, this notion of the of nafs as here's where the unconscious comes in, according to her. The nafs possesses in the Sufi literature an inner secret, an inner secret. And even this distinction between nafs as self, as id, you see the point? Like, in other words, already pregnant in the Sufi literature of the self is a lot of, you have to unearth all of that. Christian Jambé would be another seminal thinker to think these analogies and these metaphors and these comparisons. You know, his work is magisterial on Shia Islam. I mean, he is an example of someone who is a Lacanian philosopher who was trained in Qom, where they trained the seminarians and the theologians in Iran. So, you know, his work is top notch. I would also recommend that. Hopefully that gives you a feel for it, a feel for some ways to approach that question.
Thank you so much, Daniel. There are more questions here, but I'm afraid we are at our time. I wanted to thank you so much for doing this. There's a lot of value to what you're doing here, even beyond the moment. This will be used for other purposes as well. I certainly learned a lot from this. I know some of my students who are here have learned a lot from it, and opened up a lot of questions for us and a lot of work for us to continue to do. So thank you so very much for this. Before we go, though, I wanted to give you an opportunity. If you wanted to tell us what the future is for your work, what you're working on now, what comes next for you. I think it'd be really productive for all the people in this room who want to follow what it is that you're doing.
Sure. Well, as Dwayne mentioned, I've just recently released a book with a press called the International Institute of Islamic Thought on the concept of justice in Islam. And I wrote it with an Islamic scholar by the name of Ramon Harvey. And if you teach like Islamic studies, I don't know if anybody does this, we wrote I think, a very accessible introduction to the historical evolution of the meaning of justice in Islam, from the classical period, the founding, to the post-colonial period, to the present. What have all of the seminal Muslim intellectuals said regarding justice, and scholars? I'm writing a book on Marxism and psychoanalysis. The reference that I made to Leon Rosich-Schneer will feature prominently because, Dwayne, part of what I think is at stake with Freud is we must clarify the radicality of Freud's social critique. Freud's critique of the subject is a thorough criticism related to also an understanding of the classed being of artificial groups, of bourgeois groups. And when we just call that liberal and we relegate that to a culturalist understanding of liberal. And what I've tried to show is that only a class understanding of bourgeois instead of liberal will allow us to actually apply psychoanalysis in a way which is going to be more productive and more copacetic and transcend these false dichotomies of the neo-Orientalist agenda, because they want Freud to be a liberal. In a teleological, that is vulgar. I'm sorry, but that is very vulgar. Somebody asked this a beautiful question: how can a stranger be the beginning of a new social system? This is Freud's argument, which you must look at Edward Said's text, his lecture, Freud and the Non-European, to understand why the founder of a community such as Moses has this alterity to the community itself. It has to do with the otherness at the heart of the unconscious, as well as at the collective. It's an ethical point that Freud makes in a very, I would say, meta-psychological point that he makes, okay? The stranger at the heart of the unconscious is akin to the stranger at the heart of the foundation of any community, okay? Otherness. Well, why? Because a community is not found off of the same. It's found off of difference. This would be the one point I wanted to say to that. Be in this world as if you were a stranger or a traveler.
There's a reason why that question was posed to you. It carries some resonance around these parts. Some of the classes that we've been teaching. So some of the students that are here from AgaCon, although there's more than just the students here, they're taking courses in psychoanalysis where we're talking about strangeness, and there's also a Sufi course, and I think we're going to look into your book for our Islamic studies course maybe. So again, thank you so much, Daniel. Very much appreciate you doing this. We've got a lot from it, and the work will continue on our side. I appreciate it.
It was an honor. Thank you all very much. And I'd love to come back. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.